welcome back. Today we start a panel on cybersecurity issue. I'm Alice Ekman, currently based in Paris, and very glad to welcome my colleague Patrick Pollack in Brussels. Currently, Patrick is a Brussels executive officer and our analyst in charge of cyber diplomacy and cybersecurity. Welcome, Patrick.
Hi, Alice, and I wish I were with you in the wonderful studio your colleagues made in Paris, but maybe next time.
Yeah, have you seen this amazing Parisian background?
I see.
Welcome.
Beautiful sunrise.
Yeah. Okay, let's start with serious question, Patrick. Seriously, do you think 2021 will be worse than 2020 when it comes to cyber issue? Is it possible?
I don't know if it's going to be worse. I think it's going to be slightly different, but there will be certain degree of continuity as well. One interesting thing, just looking at EOIS's publications that we have released today and last month, I did a quick count and looked at some of the chapters. And what really strikes me is that more and more chapters, even from colleagues working on the regions, are actually addressing technology, cyber, and digital issues, which I think is a very interesting development. So to some extent, the fact that cyber becomes a new black, if you want, is already a big change. It's no longer a side dish at the conferences in the academic discussions, but becomes an important component of any conversation we're having on geographical or thematic issues. Now, in terms of policies, I think we're going to see a lot of continuity. We're going to see a small cyber zoo still existing. So different types of pandas, bears, cobras that will be still occupying us over the next year. But we will also see the same names of the zookeepers popping up in the press and in the media. We will hear about Russia, North Korea, Iran, China that are supporting different cyber operations. And then in terms of continuity and the motivation maybe behind those attacks, I think what we are going to see is indeed this persistent focus on cyber espionage that we have seen for years now that targets both military but also diplomatic institutions, think tanks, and other relevant organizations that have important information that can be used or weaponized later on. So I think there will be a lot of continuity in that sense. And I think the only change that we might see is to what extent the states who are basically victims of those attacks are going to be tolerating what we have seen up to date.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I must say that if the audience have any question about the animals and the zoo you mentioned, feel free to go to our YouTube live chat space. Feel free to ask any question, not just about the zoo, but any question you may have on YouTube or on Twitter. But please, if you use Twitter, use the hashtag EU4Sight. So I really understand the background that you mentioned, Patrick, but more specifically, when it comes to cybercrime, what are the concrete developments that you foresee? Often we talk about governance, cyber governance, and China-Russia convergence. Can you tell us a bit more about this? Do you see a bipolarization of the cyber governance sphere?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting discussion, and there will come later, I think, to discussing the coming Cold War 2.0. But at this stage, I think there are a few interesting processes that are happening that we should recall. So when it comes to the agenda of cyber diplomats for the coming year, it has been actually charted already 2 years ago and revised slightly in 2020. So they know more or less what to expect in terms of big policy processes. First, in May, we are going to have a discussion in New York in the third committee when concerning basically a potential cybercrime convention that you have just mentioned. We will have the launch of this new process that many states will be interested in and will follow very closely. That's the one that's really spearheaded by Russia that pushes for the new international convention when it comes to regulating cybercrime. At the same time, a few months later, in June, July, we are expecting the ongoing UN group of governmental experts and open-ended working group that are conducted under the auspices of the first committee in the UN to deliver their reports. And the interesting thing there is that both reports need to be produced by consensus. In the UNGGE, we have only 25 states. the consensus there will be very difficult to achieve. In the open-ended working group, we have 193 states, so that consensus is going to be even much harder. So everybody observing these negotiations is hopeful, but at the same time, we are very aware of the realities and this political competition that you have highlighted. And it's not a big mystery that indeed there are two big blocks clashing when it comes to that conversation. And that's partly linked to the vision of the cyberspace that these two big blocs actually would like to see promoted and adopted at the international stage.
Thank you, Patrick. And once again, feel free, audience, to ask questions via Twitter or our YouTube live chat. More specifically, the title of the panel, Patrick, refers to the Cold War. Do you really see this analogy, do you see it as relevant when we talk about cyberspace and cyber governance?
Yeah, I know that this is a very comfortable sort of a mental shortcut when we think about cyberspace. And I said, there are these two big blocks that that people like to talk about. But I personally do not think that this is a very valid comparison. I actually think that these references to Cold War are a bit more of a fear-mongering by those actors who would like to convince us that actually the world is that simple and bipolar as they would like to see. And I think the reality is much more complicated. We have prepared for this session a small visual, so if we could display that would be great. What it shows you is really the distribution of votes in 2019 when the Russia proposed resolution focusing on cybercrime was proposed. In red color, you have those who voted against the resolution. In light blue, those that voted for, and in yellow, abstentions. And the interesting thing is not those who voted against but more importantly those who abstained from voting. If you look at Latin America, we have a lot of yellow there. If you look at Asia, we have a lot of yellow there. If you look at Africa, and that's a very interesting element, we actually have a lot of countries that have voted for yes. Now, the reason why it's interesting is because for the years now, the EU has been investing a lot of money in different cyber capacity building initiatives, focusing on those parts of the world. But what it shows us with the reference to Cold War is that actually this bipolarity does not really exist, that the states actually are very often opportunistic when it comes to those discussions. We have not put on display the votes, how they distribute in the first committee, for instance, but they look also much different. So the conversation really is very often driven by the commonality of interest, potential issue linkages. So this bipolarity doesn't really exist that often as we would like to believe.
Okay, the visual was quite interesting indeed to show convergence at European level in terms of voting. But more broadly, Patrick, you underlined several important trends, but what does this trend really mean for the EU for 2021 and likely the coming years?
Yeah, I think to some extent, 2021 will be the moment of a geopolitical reckoning for the EU, if you want, when we talk about cyber diplomacy. I have recently had a very interesting conversation with one of the EU cyber ambassadors who said, listen, the EU talks a lot about being a leader when it comes to cyber diplomacy. But to be a leader, you also need followers. And I think the most interesting question in this discussion right now is, what can the EU do in order to ensure that we gain those new followers, or at least don't lose those that we already have? In 2020, the EU has also put itself on a very interesting track in the conversation about strategic autonomy, technical independence, sovereignty, and so on. And these conversations are followed really very closely around the world, and that also implies that very often, or sometimes very often, we will actually see other actors challenging this narrative. In the United States, we have seen Clean Network Initiative that was proposed. In China, we have a new initiative focusing on data security. So all those actors are actually adopting very similar conclusions. Now, the big question is, how is the EU going to explain to the other actors, those in yellows and light blues that we have seen on the map, that maybe what we are proposing is better, And also, what are the benefits of aligning more with the European way if we want to think about technology, cyber, and digital issues? And I think that's one of the challenges that we will really have to struggle with. Now, there is a good news as well, of course. Some of that work has already been done throughout 2020. Only in December, we had the presentation of the new EU cybersecurity strategy. In the first quarter of this year, we also expect the Commission to present a sort of a digital, global digital engagement strategy that will again sort of outline how we want to do that. And there is, of course, the digital compass that's also on the agenda. So some thinking has been done. Now the question is how far and how good we'll be in explaining what's behind all those decisions and ideas that the EU and the member states have put on the paper.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I still have 2 more questions for you, but before that, let's remind our audience that everyone can ask questions through our YouTube live chat space, but also via Twitter. If you do that, please use the hashtag EU Foresight. So, Patrick, one more question for you, 2 more questions actually. One is, what are the uncertainties or the disruption that you may envisage in 2021, and that could impact the trend that you developed so far? And the second question, let me ask it to you in a row, is related to COVID. So far, we haven't really mentioned COVID in our discussion. Do you consider COVID as an accelerator of cyber attack and really having an impact on the general trends that are shaping the cyberspace, or do you think it's business as usual?
So these are 2 very good questions. Let me start with the first one. What do we expect in terms of uncertainties or disruptive elements? And I think it's a very interesting question for the cyber community, because actually this community lives and breathes uncertainty on a daily basis. You know, every day, those who deal with the IT systems go and deal in their workplaces with constant attacks. The policymakers live and breathe this uncertainty as well by thinking, what are those next big attacks that will require them to take decisive actions and follow with a political response. So this element of uncertainty is there. Now, if I think about what could be those issues that can potentially disrupt some of the elements that I have presented, I would probably think that, you know, something that we as the cyber community have been discussing for years right now is, you know, there's a reference to Cyber Katarina or Cyber 9/11, this big event that will have huge impact, and it could be an attack on critical infrastructure protection. It could be an attack that results with deaths of substantial number of people, that then will push states to respond more forcefully and potentially trigger an armed conflict. Of course, there is also another spectrum in that conversation that experts have been highlighting, and actually that's something we have seen very often. That we have those attacks, continued attacks below the threshold of armed conflict that actually states do not always really know how to deal with. And what we might see is indeed, if some of those states that suffer attacks are going to adopt a more assertive position, for instance, vis-a-vis cyber espionage, and say enough is enough, we think that this is a violation of our sovereignty and we're going to act in a specific way, right? That would potentially be quite an interesting element, because that would trigger big discussions at the international stage. Now, I think there is also a few elements that were partly mentioned throughout the day as well. And I think one of the big disruptors and uncertainty that we have is how the relationship between the private sector and the governments is going to shape. And the session with Natalie this morning focused a lot on the social media platforms. And I think there will be a lot of discussion there when it comes to content regulation. But we also have other issues on the table there, you know, the idea of encryption, when we talk about cyber surveillance technologies and export of those technologies to authoritarian regimes. All those issues will be coming up, I think, throughout the year more. Also because the EU has taken a very clear stance that the human rights online should be protected as much as offline, and intends to take this more forceful action. Now, there could be a potential positive disruptor as well, which I have outlined in What If Not scenario that we have published today. Very often, as I said, we do not really talk to the zookeepers. We do not talk to Russia, China, or North Korea, or Iran that often when it comes to their behavior in cyberspace. And what could be an interesting disruptor is if we started thinking about possible ways of running dialogues with those countries, something that for the moment is really non-existent. Now, your second question was about COVID, and to what extent it has, and to what extent that has been an accelerator. And I think that's an interesting question, because 2020 has been this wake-up call, I think, for many communities. COVID and the attacks against healthcare facilities or the laboratories that were working on the vaccination have actually made people realize that there is much more to that conversation than just the IT aspect of it, or this very purely technological aspect. We have seen attack on the hospital in Düsseldorf. We have seen the attacks on the European Medicine Agency. So all that has actually brought this question of responsible or irresponsible behavior in cyberspace more to the front of the conversations that we have seen. And in that sense, it has paradoxically made cyber issues and cyber conversations quite a mainstream in the discussions that we've had. So to some extent, it has helped us to get the message across, but unfortunately, it took the pandemic, or very often it takes a big strategy to pass the message along. And that's quite unfortunate.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. You mentioned publication, What If Not? Your chapter is published and available on UISS website, free to download. So I invite our audience to check it out. Patrick, we received several questions, so I would like to share them with you. The first one is the following. What do you think about closing accounts on, for example, Twitter? Should it be considered as censorship or mean to counter misinformation? I think this question would be a bit more for Natalie, but maybe you have a comment on it, if any.
Listen, I think something that Natalie has really flagged during her presentation was that these cases have to always be taken in a specific context, and there is a very clear sort of balancing act that states have to undertake, so that when we talk about personal freedoms, freedom of expression, and then the potential impact and security implications of certain actions, whether it's a censorship or not, we have the new legislation that has been proposed by the European Union right now, and these conversations are very likely to continue. But as I said, I do not really think that you can very often say a priori what that is going to imply, whether it's going to be censorship or not. The big difference that we have in the European Union and other like-minded countries that have actually put countering misinformation on the top of their agenda is the fact that you also have a very strong rule of law that accompanies those processes, and you also have the institutions that ensure accountability of those that take those decisions. But I agree that it is going to be an interesting conversation to have, also because similar decisions and those actions will be really observed by other countries like China and Russia, who are, of course, much interested in having those regulations and instruments in place.
Okay, many thanks, Patrick. A more geostrategic question. Where could the EU's role lie related to international digital industry, in particular in relation to US and Chinese digital giants? I don't know if you understand it clearly, yeah?
Yeah, I think that's basically. I think that's a question about the industry and the European way that High Representative Borrell also was promoting. Again, I think we are very often pushed in the conversation about digital engagements globally to pick and kind of position the European Union in this conversation between the US and China. I think over the past year, what we have seen originating from the EU is this potentially identified niche for the European Union contribution. And that is primarily linked to these human-centric technologies that the commissioners have been always talking about. If you look at the model that originates from China, where you have a lot of those technologies relying on AI, for instance, those are really rarely fully ethical. Actually, quite frequently, we talk about violations of human rights, and that's something that you have mentioned in your session this morning as well. When you look at the US, the Twitter example is a very good one. The positions that the huge multinational companies have adopted. For instance, if you look in the ongoing discussion between Google and Australia, for instance, that's something that actually shows you that the models are not necessarily functioning well, and that there is a lot of a middle ground that can be occupied. And I think where there is a certain opening for the EU is exactly to identify that middle ground and push for technologies that are human-centric, that take human rights considerations into account, like we have already done, for instance, with the adaptations of technologies that are compliant with data protection regulations, and take this right to privacy really into account and propose the solutions to protect those rights. So I think that for me is a big opening and something that the European Union can push, and that ironically can reconcile this idea of being a normative power with being a digital power. And I think that's an opportunity we should grasp.
Thanks, Patrick. A last question, and I'd like to ask you to be very short because we have only 50 seconds left to be precise. Which international organization is the most suitable for cyber-related discussions, according to you?
Listen, I don't think there is one organization where we can go to, because all of them have very different mandates and competences. I think if we're really talking about, the use of force in cyberspace and potential cyber conflict, UN remains the only valid path. Now, of course, there are in international law provisions that allow states to take unilateral actions. So that is something that we might see more often of. There is a huge economic component to that conversation, where some of those conversations, especially about AI, new technologies and data protection, but also cybersecurity, can be taken on board. And here I'm thinking primarily about the OECD. You also have organizations like the Council of Europe, for instance, that are quite active when it comes to the regulation of cooperation in fighting cybercrime, with the Budapest Convention as the core instrument. We should not forget about OSCE, that is our regional instrument, where a lot of confidence building measures have been proposed exactly to prevent those risks of conflict escalation. So I think we really have to be looking in many different directions. And unfortunately, that is not such a great news because it requires a lot of resources. But that should also push the EU to adopt a more unified front and more coherence and joined up approach that the global strategy was talking about so often and so extensively.
And more unified and more also network-based, we could say, given the diversity of institutions you mentioned. Many thanks, Patrick. That was wonderful, very stimulating. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience learned a lot too. Please, audience, stay tuned, because our next session will be on the US, and more specifically on Biden administration and what is in the pipeline for 2021. And this will be with the presence of our expert, Simona Soare. So stay tuned, and hope to see you again soon.